Welcome to the Podlets podcast.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Podlets. In this episode, we're going to talk about, one of the more challenging things that we all have to do is just kind of keep up with cloud native and how we each approach that and what we do. Today, I have a number of co-hosts with me. I have Olive Power.
Hi.
Alicia Campos.
Hi, everybody.
Josh Rosso.
Hey, all.
And Michael.
Hey, hello.
So this episode, we're going to do something a little different than we normally do. In most of our episodes, we try to remain somewhat objective around the problem and the potential solutions for it, rather than prescripting a particular solution. In this episode, however, since we're talking about how we keep up with all of the crazy things that happen in such a fast-moving ecosystem, we're going to probably provide quite a number of examples or resources that you yourself could use to try and keep up to date with what's happening out there. So be sure to check out the notes after the episode is over at thepodlets.io, and you will find a link to the episodes up on the top bar, and you can click down to this episode and check out the notes, because there'll be tons of resources. So let's get started. One of the things I think about that is interesting about keeping up with something like a Kubernetes or a fast-moving project, regardless of what that project is, whether it's Kubernetes or, for a while it was Mesos that I was following, or OpenStack, or there's a number of big infrastructure projects that have been very fast moving over time. And I think what's interesting is that I find that there's multiple audiences that we kind of address when we think about what it means to keep up. Right? Keeping up with something like a project is interesting, because I feel like there is an audience that is actually very interested in what's happening with the design goals or the code base of the project. And there's an audience that is very specific to just wanting to understand, at a high level, like, give me the state of the world report like every month or so, just so I can understand generally like what's happening with the project. Like, is it thriving? Is it starting to kind of wane? Are there big projects that it's taking on? And then I feel like there's an audience somewhere in the middle there where they really want to see people using the project and understand and know how to learn from those people who are using it, so that they can elevate their own use of that project. They're not particularly interested in the code base per se, but they do want to understand, are they exploring this project at a depth that makes sense for themselves? What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I want to mention is that this episode is not so much about onboarding people onto Kubernetes and the Kubernetes ecosystem. We are going to have an episode soon to talk specifically about that, like how you get going, like get started. So I think Duffy mentioned this. So we're going to be talking about how you keep up with things. But definitely there are different audiences, even when we're talking about keeping up. And yeah.
Yeah, I think what's funny about your audience descriptions, Duffy, is I feel like I've actually slid between those audiences a bit, right? So it's funny because like back in the day, Kubernetes like 1.4.1.5 days, I feel like I was much more like, what's going on in the code? Like trying to keep track of like how things are progressing. Now my role is a lot more focused with working with customers and standing up Kube and like making it production ready. So I feel like I'm a lot more kind of reactive and more interested to see like what features have become stable and impact me. You know what I mean? I'm far less in the weeds than I used to be. It's a super interesting thing.
I can hear that.
Yeah, I tend to, for my role, I tend to definitely fall into the number 3 first, which is the kind of general keeping an eye on things. And when you see like interesting articles pop up that maybe have been linked internally because somebody said, oh, check out this article, it's really interesting. And then you find that you can kind of click through 5 or 6 articles similar. But then you can kind of flip to that kind of like, oh, I'm kind of learning lots of good stuff generally about, things that folk are doing, to actually kind of having to figure out some particular solution for one of my customers. And so having to go quite deep into that particular feature. So I kind of find myself going right in and then back out, and right in, going back out, depending on kind of where I am on a particular day of the week. And it's kind of a bit tricky. My brain sometimes doesn't kind of deal with that sort of, deep concentration into one particular topic and then back out again. So it's not easy. I find it quite tough actually some of the time.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. Keeping track of everything is
Yeah.
That's why the episode, right, is like how do we even approach it? It seems, I feel like what an audience I haven't mentioned is the audience that basically just throws up their hands and walks away because there's just too much to keep track of, right? Like and I feel like we are all that at some point, like I get that.
That's why we have Christmas holidays, right? To kind of
exactly.
to refresh the brain.
Yep.
Yeah, I am maybe purposefully or maybe not even, not trying to keep up because it is too much. It is a lot. And what I'm trying to do is get better, go deeper on the things that I already like sort of know and things that I am working with on a day-to-day basis. And I only really need to know, I feel that I really only need to know, because I'm not working directly with customers. My scope is very well defined. And I feel that I really only need to know whenever there's a new Kubernetes release, I need to know what's in the releases. And we usually, every once in a while, we update our project we bump up the Kubernetes release that we are working against. But in general, yeah, it's like if things come my way, then if it's interesting, I'll take a look. But mostly, I feel like I work in a spiral. So if I'm doing codes related to controllers and there's a conference talk about controllers, then okay, let me take a look at this to maybe I'll learn how to, design this thing better, implement this thing in a better way if I know more about it. So if I'm doing, looking at CRDs, the same thing. I really like conference talks for education, but that's not so much keeping up with what's new. Are we talking about educating ourselves with things that we don't know about, keep track of things that we don't know about, or are we talking about just news?
I think it's everything. I think it's, I think that, keeping, that's a great question, because like one of my other questions when we were starting to talk about this was like, what does keeping up even mean? Right? Like, I mean, does it mean, where do you find resources that are interesting that keep you interested in the project? Or are you looking for resources that just kind of keep you up to date with what's changing? It's a great question.
Yeah, and actually that was the problem that I faced when I added the links that I wanted to share in the show. So I started writing the links, and then I realized, well, most of the stuff is not keeping up with news. It's actually understanding the technology, because I cannot keep up. So what does help me in understanding specific areas when I need to dig into that? And I think back 5 or 4 years in the early days of Kubernetes, it was easy to catch up by the time, because it was just about Kubernetes. Mm-hmm. But then later it became this platform. Like we realized that it's actually this platform thing. And then we extended Kubernetes, and then we realized there's CI/CD related stuff and operations and monitoring. And so the whole ecosystem grew, like the landscape grew so much that today it's impossible to keep up, right? And I think I'm interested in all those patterns that you have developed over the years that help you to manage this, let's say, complexity or stream of information.
Yeah, agreed. I was actually I was thinking about this year. I was thinking about putting up a talk with Chris Short. It was actually last year. That was about kind of on the same topic of keeping up with it. And so in that, I kind of did a little research into how that happens. And I feel like what some of the interesting stuff that came out of that was that there are certain patterns that a project might take on that make it easier or more approachable to stay in contact with what's happening. And if we take Kubernetes as an example, there are a number of websites, I think that pretty much everybody here kind of follows to some degree, that help sort of kind of address those different audiences that we were talking about. Like one of the ones that I've actually been really impressed with is LWKD, which stands for Last Week in Kubernetes Development. And as you can imagine, this is really kind of focused on kind of, I wouldn't say it's like super deep on the development, but it is watching for things that are changing that are interesting to the person who isn't to the people who are curating that particular post, right? And so they'll have things in there like, code freeze is coming up on this date. IPv6, IPv4 dual stack is merging. They'll have like some of the big mile markers that are happening in a particular release and where they are in time as it relates to that release. And I think that that's a great pattern, and I think that but it's a very narrow audience, right? Like it would really only be interesting to people who are interested in or who are caught up in the code base or just trying to understand, like, maybe I want a preview of what the release notes might look like, and so I might just look for like a weekly, kind of thing.
Yeah, and speaking of the release notes, right? Because it's funny, like I think, and I do get to look at last week in Kubernetes development every now and then. It's an awesome resource. But I've gotten to the point where the release notes are probably my most important thing for staying up to date. And maybe it's because I'm lazy, I don't know, but I wait till 1.17 drops. Then I go to the release notes and really kind of ingest it, because I've just struggled so much to kind of keep up with like the day-to-day. We merged this, we didn't merge this, and so on. So those have been a huge help for me, day or week to week, month to month.
Yeah. What was also helpful just on the release notes, that the new filter webpage that they put out in 1.15, starting 1.15. Have you all seen that?
I've never heard of it.
Whatever it is, rel.
Yeah. If you can share it, Duffy, like that's super useful, especially like if you want to compare releases and features added. And otherwise I can dig it out. Like
I'll have to dig it up as well. I don't remember exactly.
I'm sorry. Say
rel notes.
Which one is that again?
The rel notes.
What is it?
I'll put it in. I'll put it in the HackMD.
Yeah, it's relnotes.kh.io. Which is an interesting one because it's sort of like a comparison engine that allows you to kind of compare when a feature, like how a feature relates to different versions and stuff.
Oh, that's great. I cannot encourage enough for the listeners to look at the show notes, because we have a little document here that we're looking at, and the resources are amazing. There are so many things that I have never even heard about and sound great. I want to go through this whole entire list. Yep. So definitely check it out. We might not have time to mention every single thing, so I don't want people to miss on all the goodness that's been put together.
Agreed. And if you're looking for those notes, you just go to the podlets.io, click on episodes up on the upper right, and then look for this episode, and you'll find the notes there.
And I can see that a lot of the content in those notes are like Twitter feeds. Speaking personally, I'm not sure I'm at the stage yet where I learn a lot about Twitter feeds in terms of technical content. Do you guys find that it's more around people's thoughts around certain things, so thought-provoking things around Kubernetes and the ecosystem, rather than actual technical content? I mean, that's my experience so far. But looking at those Twitter feeds, maybe I guess I might need to follow some of those feeds. What do you all think?
Go ahead, Carlos.
No, go ahead, Michael.
I just asking, do you mean the tweets are from those like learned Kates or the person tweet feeds?
Like you've listed some there, Michael. There's some sort of...
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to get some clarity. So the reason I listed so many Twitter accounts there is because Twitter is my only kind of news feed, if you will. Like I used Feedly and RSS and others before, and emails and threads. But then I just got overwhelmed, and I had this feeling of missing out on all those ends. So that's why I said, okay, let's just use Twitter. And so to your question, most of these accounts are people who've been in the Kubernetes space for very long, either running Kubernetes, developing on Kubernetes, having opinions about Kubernetes, or opinions in general on topics related to cloud native, because we didn't want to make the show just about Kubernetes. And so most of these people, I really appreciate their thoughts, and some of them also just retweet things that they see which I miss somewhere else. So not necessarily just opinions. I think it's a good mix of these accounts providing opinions some guidance, and also just news that I miss out on because not being on the other channels.
Yeah, I agree. Because sometimes you can kind of read, if I tend to read quite a lot of sort of like blog posts and sort of web posts, which are sort of, without realizing it can be kind of opinionated. And then, it's nice to then see some Twitter feeds that kind of actually just kind of give like a kind of a couple of words, a kind of a different view, which kind of, sometimes makes me think, okay, I understand that topic from a certain article that I've read. It's just really nice to hear a kind of a different take on it through Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. For my part,
Can I go next?
Listen, for my part, I've been actually.
Let me go next. Oh no. All right, go, Duffy.
No, you're up.
All right. So I think some of the accounts, like fewer of the accounts, and there are a bunch of things that are listed accounts here that I didn't know before, so I'll check them out. So I think fewer of the accounts are providing technical content. For example, Cindy Sidaran, I'm not completely pronouncing it correctly, but Cindy is great. She puts out a lot of technical content and a lot of technical opinion and observations. That is really good to consume. I wish I had time. Just read her blog posts and Twitter commentary alone. She's very oriented towards distributed systems in general. So she's not even specific just Kubernetes. But most of the accounts are very opinionated. And the benefit for me is that sometimes I catch people talking about something that I didn't even know it was a thing. It's like, oh, this is a thing. and I should know about for the work that I do. And like Michael was saying, sometimes I catch retweets that I didn't catch before. And I'm not checking out places. I'm not checking Reddit. So I rely on Twitter and the people I follow to, if there's a blog post that sounds important, I just trust that somebody I'm going to see that multiple times until like, okay, if this is content that is related to something I'm working on that I want to get better at, then I'll go and look at it. But my sources are mainly Twitter and YouTube. And it's funny because I love blog posts, but I can't, it's like I haven't been reading them because it takes a long time to read a blog post. And so I give preference to video because I can just listen while I'm doing stuff. But so I sort of stopped reading blog posts, which is sad. And anyway, I also want to start writing posts because it's so helpful for me to ingrain the things that I'm learning. And hopefully it'll be helpful to other people too. But in any case, go Duffy.
I was going to say, yeah, I think it's interesting. There are a number of people that I follow. I've been cultivating my feed pretty carefully, trying to get a broad perspective of technical stuff that's happening. But also I've been trying to develop my persona on Twitter a bit more, right? Like I'm actually trying to build my audience there. And so what's interesting there is that I've been trying, to that end, what I've been doing is like trying to like amplify voices that I think aren't heard enough out there, right? And so if I see an article by somebody who's just coming into Kubernetes or just coming into distributed systems and they've taken an effort to like really like lay out something that they found really interesting about pretty much anything, right? I'm like, okay, well, that's pretty awesome. And I'll try to amplify that, right? And sometimes I even get involved where I'll, not directly in public on Twitter, but I'll offer to like help edit or help provide, whatever guidance I can provide around that sort of stuff. So if I see them, if I see people like having a difficult time with a particular project or something like that, I'll reach out privately and say, hey, can I help you with this thing so that you can go out there and, do a great job, like this is totally something I love to do. But I think your point about like, not necessarily going at Twitter for like the deep knowledge stuff, but more just like making sure that making sure that you have a broad enough awareness of what's happening in different ecosystems that you're not surprised by things when things change, right? Like a couple of the people that I follow are Akira Suda. I can't say enough about that person. They are amazing. they have been doing like incredibly deep security stuff as it relates to containerization and stuff like that for quite a while. And so I'm always like learning brand new things to me when following a community and folks like that, you know. And like I've been kind of getting more interested in InfoSec Twitter lately, kind of learning how people kind of approach that problem, like and also some of the bias around that, which has been pretty interesting. Both the bias against people who are in InfoSec, which seems weird to me, and also like how InfoSec approaches a problem. Like, do they approach it like a learning experience, or do they approach it like an attack experience? It's been kind of fascinating to kind of dig in there.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, it was just like just to close that out, because you know, like when I kind of like use Twitter as well for some of the stuff, but books are kind of a resource as well. But in my head, I kind of like at the opposite scale, and I don't read as many books as I read Twitter feeds, right? And it's just kind of like with Twitter, you can kind of digest a whole load of stuff, and with books, it's kind of like I tend to be trying, because I know I'm only going to read it, like I'm only going to read maybe 1/2 books a year. I don't know. I've kind of like, as I said before, web blog posts seem to take up my reading time, and books kind of tend to be for like on airplanes and stuff. So they're just kind of two opposite kind of resources for me. But I find actually the content of books are probably stuff that I digest a bit more, because it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm back to the old days. It's kind of a physical thing in hand, and I can kind of read it and digest it a bit more than sort of the kind of throwaway stuff that kind of keeps on Twitter. Because to be honest, I don't know always on Twitter who's kind of a person to listen to or who's not, and I just try and form my own opinions. And then again, it kind of gets a bit overwhelming, because there's a lot of content just streaming through continuously, where the book, it's kind of like just one source of information that it's kind of like a bit more personal, that I can digest a bit more.
Any particular book recommendation in 2019, Olive, that you found particularly interesting?
So I'm still reading, and it's on the list for the episode notes, actually, Programming Kubernetes, because I just want to kind of get into that sort of CRD sort of mindset a bit. I think that's kind of an area that's interesting, and an area that a lot of people will want to use in their organizations, right? Because it's going to do some of the extensibility to Kubernetes that's just not there out of the box. And everybody wants something that's not out of the box, always, in my experience.
Yep.
Yeah.
I found the Managing Kubernetes, I think, was it from Brandon Burns and some other folks, which was just released, I think, end of last year. Super deep. And that is kind of the opposite to the Programming Kubernetes, because I like that as well. But that is more geared towards understanding architecture and operational control.
They're probably the two books I've read.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they're good. Yeah, one a year, remember?
Oh yeah, so
prolific reading.
I think if you know what you need to learn about cloud native or Kubernetes, there's amazing books out there. And if you are still exploring Kubernetes and trying to learn, I cannot recommend this book enough. If you are watching us on YouTube, you'll see the cover. It's called Kubernetes Best Practices, because it's really about Kubernetes best practices, but what they did simultaneously, and maybe they didn't even realize, is just they gave a map, entire thing. So you go, oh, these are all the elements in Kubernetes. Of course, it's also saying, okay, this is the best way to go about setting the stuff up. And it's relatively thin, but I just think that going through this book, you get really fast overview of all the elements in Kubernetes. And then you can go to other books like Managing Kubernetes to go deep and understand all of the knobs and switches.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to the patterns that we see successful projects that you think are approachable, projects that are out there, and make it easy for you to kind of stay, or easier at least, to stay up to date with, and what some of those patterns are that you think are useful for projects. And so we were talking about, like, having having, perhaps a couple of different entry points from kind of a weekly report mechanism. We've talked about the one that LWKD is. I don't think we've yet talked about Cube Weekly, which is actually a weekly blog that is actually curated by a lot of the CNCF ambassadors. Cube Weekly is also broken up into different sections. Like sometimes they'll just talk about, but they're actually going out actively and trying to find articles of people using Kubernetes and trying to post those, so that if you're interested in understanding, how people are actually out there using it, then that's a great place to go find articles that are kind of related to that. What are some other patterns that we see that are out there that are useful for folks?
One that I really like, so Kubernetes, for everyone listening, has this notion of special interest groups, SIGs, oftentimes, and they're focused on like certain areas of the project. So there's some for networking and storage and life cycles of clusters. And what's amazing, I try to watch them somewhat weekly, I don't always succeed, is they're all on YouTube. And if you go to the Kubernetes project YouTube, there's playlists for every SIG. So a lot of times I'm doing work relating to life cycles of clusters. So I'll open up the cluster life cycle playlist and I'll just watch the weekly meetings. Like, while it doesn't always pertain completely to me, it lets me understand kind of where the developers and contributors' heads are at and where they're kind of headed with a lot of different things. So there's a link to that as well if anyone wants to check it out.
Yeah, and for
thumbs up to what Josh just said.
Exactly, and to add to that, if you don't have the time to watch the videos, the meeting notes that these gentlemen and women put together are amazing. So usually I just scroll through, and if there's something that triggers, I go into the episode and then watch it.
Yeah.
So like as a filter.
I almost, sorry, Michael, I talked over you. I almost feel like we should talk about tooling to handle all of this stuff. For example, right now, I think I have 200 tabs open, and I just started learning about some Chrome extensions to manage tabs. I haven't started really using them, but I need. And so I don't have a good system. My system is open a video that I'm pretty sure I want to watch and just get to that tab eventually until something happens and my Chrome goes bust and I lose all the everything. But wanted to mention that when we say watch YouTube, some things you don't need to sit there and actually watch. You can just listen to it. And if you pay for the $5 for YouTube Premium, I don't get a commission, you people, but I'm just saying, for me, it's so helpful. I can just turn off, put my phone on my pocket and keep listening to it without having to have the phone open and on the whole time. It's very handy.
Yep.
It's just like listening to a podcast. And I also listen to podcasts, lots of it.
Yep. For tooling, since I'm just mostly on Twitter, and by the time I was using Twitter or starting to use Twitter, they didn't have this bookmark function. So I was basically abusing likes or favorites by the time, I think, to bookmark. And what I realized, and later my bookmarks grew. Oh, well, my likes grew. And I wanted to go back and find something, but that through the Twitter search was just impossible. So I built a tiny little Go tool, kind of my first exercise there, to just parse my likes and then use JQ, because it's all JSON, to query and manipulate this stuff. And so that's like, I almost use it every day, because I was like, oh, there was a talk or blog post about scheduling, and I just grab for scheduling and in the likes. I'm sure there's a better tool or way of doing that, but for me, that's my tool, because that's my workflow.
There's actually, there's also both of the two blogs that we mentioned, both Cube Weekly and LWKD. They both have the ability to take that you can submit stories to them. So if you come across things that are interesting and you'd like to put that up on an aggregator somewhere, like this is one of the ways to kind of solve that problem. Because at least if you put it up on an aggregator, you know that you can go back to the aggregator to see it. So that helps. Some other ones I've seen out there, I've seen a number of interesting startups now are starting to kind of like put out a podcast, and I've started to see a number of people like, engaging with Twitch and also doing things like what we do with TGIK.io, which is like have sort of some kind of a weekly thing where you're like, just hacking on stuff live and, just exploring it, whether that is related to, the neat thing about TGIK is we can do it without being related necessarily to anything that we're doing at VMware, just anything to do with the community. But like, obviously, if you were like working for like one of the smaller companies, like a Honeycomb or some other company, a smaller kind of startup, you could really just get people more aware of that, because for some reason people love to watch others code, right? They love to understand like how people go through that, like what their thought process is, and it's totally one of the. I find it awesome as well, but like I think it's amazing to me that how big a draw that is,
And is there lots of them out there, Duffy? Is that kind of an easy searchable thing, or is it kind of like how do you know those things are going on?
Oddly enough, Twitter most of the time. Yeah, I mean, like most of the time, it's like I see that kind of stuff happening on Twitter. Like somebody will, like Alice Goldfest or a number of other people will say, "Okay, I'm going to do a live stream during this period of time on this." And I've actually seen a number of people doing live streams on CTFs, which are capture the flags, which I think that one's really been fascinating to me, because it's been like, how do people think about approaching the security of an application? Like, where do they look for weak spots, and how do you determine, like, how do you approach that kind of a problem, which is fascinating, So yeah, I think it is important to remember that, like, you're not the only one trying to keep up to date with all of this stuff, right? I mean, like it is one thing that we've all said pretty consistently here is that it is a lot. It is, and it's not just Kubernetes, right? Like any fast-moving project, right? It could be your favorite Ruby module, like that has 200 contributors, right? Like it doesn't matter what it is a lot to keep a track of, and it kind of represents some of that, a cognitive overhead that you have to think about, like that's a lot to take on. So even if it is overwhelming, if you find value in being up to date with these things, just figure out, like, there are so many resources out there that address these different audiences, and figure out like what the right measure for you is, right? You don't have to go deep on the code on everything. Sometimes it might be better to just try and find a source of information that gives you a high enough view, right? Like maybe you're looking at the blog posts that come out on Kubernetes.io every release, and you're just looking at the release notes. And if you just read the release notes every release, that is already like miles ahead of what I've seen a lot of folks out there when they're starting to ask me questions about how do you keep up to date,
Yeah.
I'm curious. We've been talking a lot about keeping up as an individual. Do you all have strategies for how you help, let's say, your overall team keep up with all the things that are going on? Like, to give an example, Duffy, Olive, and myself, at least at one point, were on the same team, and we'd go out to disparate customers and see all these different new things that they were trying to do or new projects they were using. So we'd have to think about, how do we get together and share that internally to make sure we're kind of bringing the whole team along with what's going on in the ecosystem, especially from a customer perspective. I know one of the ways that we do that is kind of having like demos and things of that nature that we share weekly. Are there other strategies that you all use with your teams to kind of, share interesting information and news?
It's a really tough problem. Yeah, carry on, Michael.
Oh, yeah, that was a good start. So what we do is mostly the way we share in our team, and we're a small team, we use Slack, and we pre-filter in terms of like if there's stuff that I think is valuable for me, and probably not for the whole team. Obviously, I'm not going to share, but I think if it's related to something the team does or it's a common ground, then I'll share on Slack. But we don't have any formal way of. I know people use some reports, weekly reports, or other platforms to distribute, but we just use Slack and just paste in Slack and discuss on Slack.
I think one of the patterns that we had at Heptio that I thought was actually super helpful was that we would engage a conversation. Like I learned a cool new thing about whatever today, right? And so we would say, and then we'd start up a Zoom call around that, and then people could join if they wanted to be a part of the live discussion or not. And if they didn't, they would still be able to see the recorded Zoom pop up in the channel later on. So even if your like time zones don't line up, like I know it's 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or something like that for Olive right now, you can still go back to those. You can still go back to those recorded sessions, and because you'll see it in the daily Slack stuff, right? You'll be able to see, there was a conversation about, whether you should deploy Kubernetes across availability zones or not. I would like to go see that, and see what the inputs were. And so that can be helpful.
Yeah, it's a super interesting observation. It's almost like remote first teams that are kind of used to these processes of recording everything and putting it in a Google Doc. They're kind of more equipped for that information sharing, perhaps in like the water cooler conversations you'd have in the office.
And on the Slack, or any other communication tool, we kind of have like different channels, right? Because, we're all in lots of channels, and to have channels dedicated to a particular subject is absolutely the way to go. Because otherwise, I in my previous company, there seemed to be kind of one main channel that all the kind of architects used to discuss everything on. And, sometimes you kind of join in and you're like, what is everybody talking about? There'd literally be like 100 messages on some sort of thing that I'd never heard of. So you kind of come away from that thinking, that's the kind of main channel. Where's the bit? Is there messages in the middle of that I missed that were kind of just normal discussions as opposed to in around the technical stuff? And so it kind of made me a bit sad, right? Because I'd be like, I haven't understood something, and there's a whole lot of stuff on this channel that I don't understand, but it's the kind of central channel for everyone. So it kind of like think, you end up then start looking up things that they're discussing and then realizing actually that's not really anything related to what I need to know about today or next week. It might be something for the future, but I've got other stuff to focus on. So, my point is that, those communication channels for me sometimes can kind of make me feel a little bit like behind the curve or very much sort of reactive and trying to jump on things that are actually not really anything to do with me for now, and kind of wasting my time slightly, and kind of messing with my head a little bit in that, like, I really need to try and focus out stuff, and actually putting the right content in the right channel, at least from a higher level, helps me decide whether I want to like look at that channel today, or whether I've got time. And stuff that should be in the channel is not kind of in a kind of a conversational channel. So organization of where that content is kind of important to me.
I am so on the same page with you, Olive. I that's the way my brain works as well. I want to have multiple channels. Like if we're talking about Slack or like any chat tool, but some people have such an aversion to multiple channels. They really have a hard time dealing with too many, past that threshold of what they think is too many channels. So I'm always mindful too, no, it has to work for everybody. But if it was up to me, there will be one channel per topic, so I know what to focus on. And you said something that's so interesting. How do we even like you were saying in the context of multiple channels, and you like, if I need to pay attention to this week, as opposed to like I don't need to look at this until sometime in the future. How do we even decide, right, what we focus on because it's useful for us in the moment versus it will be good for me to know, but I don't need to know right now. I am super bad at, because when I see something that is going to give me the fundamentals, but I don't need, like I have other priorities now, I sort of want to always consume that to learn the fundamentals because I think in the long term pays off. But then I neglect, obviously, what I need to know to do in the moment. And I'm trying to sort of switch that and get focused on the in-the-moment things. Anybody else have a hard time?
You are not alone in that. Yeah.
It's terrible.
And so something that I wish I would do more often, as like being a good citizen, is if like we read a lot. Probably 90% of my time is not writing but reading, maybe even more. Yeah. And then I share. And then on Twitter, the tweets that the most successful ones in terms of like retweets or likes are the ones where I do like TLDRs or some screen captures, like too long didn't read, where people don't have the time. They might want to read the article, but they don't have time. But if you put in like a TLDR, like either a tweet or a thread on it, a lot of people will jump onto it because they can just easily capture it and they can still read the full article if they want. But like that is kind of something I learned that is pretty what's the right word, helpful to my followers and the community. But I just don't do it that often, unfortunately. And by writing, summarizing, writing, I kind of remember like that's how the brain works. It's a kind of nice side effect.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, Duffy.
I was saying this is definitely one of those things where you can be the change you want to see. You know, like if
yeah, I know.
You know this is awesome. I will also say that what you've just raised, Kalish, is like a super valid point. I mean, like not everybody's brain works the same way, right? Like there are people who are neurodivergent. There are people who think very linearly and they're very comfortable with that, and people who don't. You know, and so like it's a struggle, I think, regardless of how your brain is wired, to understand how to prioritize the attention you will give any given subject. But in some cases, your brain is not wired. Your brain is almost wired against that whole idea. Like you know, like you're just not set up for success when it comes to figuring out how to prioritize your attention.
I think you said you hit the nail on the head. We are so set up for failure in that department because there are so many interesting conversations and you want to hop in and you want to be part of the conversation, part of the group and socialize. Our work is so isolating. If we really put our heads down and just work, it can be isolating. So it's great to participate in conversations out there, even if it's even if it's via Twitter. I mean, obviously we are very biased towards Twitter here, this group, but not everyone even is on Twitter. So just to keep that in mind, that we're cognizant of that. But in any case, for me, I think the answer, so I don't know what the answer is, but what I'm trying now is to cut down on those social activities that seem so appealing. I don't know how to do that, but I'm working on.
I'm in the same boat. 2020, I'm hoping to let more of that go. And it's not that, to your point, it's not that there's no value in it. It's just, I don't know, I'm not deriving the same amount of quality out of it because I'm so just multiplexed all over the place, right? So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Oh, if any listener has opinions and obviously we seems that all of us are helpless in that department. Share with us, please.
It's a tricky one. I think it's also interesting because I find that when we talk about things like work-life balance, right? We think of the idea of like, you know, maybe work-life balance is that when you come to the end of the day, you go home and you don't think about work. Right. And sometimes we think that work-life balance means that you have a certain amount of time off that you can actually spend with your family and or your friends or your community, what have you, right? And not be engaging on multiple fronts, right? Like just have that be your focus. But when it comes to things like keeping up, right? When it comes to things like learning or elevating your education and stuff, it seems like, for the most part, and this is just my own assumption, I'm curious how you all feel about this, that doesn't enter into it, right? Your personal time is totally on the table when it comes to how do you keep up with these things. We don't even think about it that way, right? Like, I know I personally don't. Like, I definitely have to do more to cut back on the amount of time that I spend reading. I'm right there with Michael on 90% of my time. With my eyes are open, they're either reading or staring up at the sky while I try and think about what I'm going to write next. You know, one way or the other. It's like that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I noticed last year on my Twitter feed more people than the years before were complaining about like personal burnout, and I saw kind of a pattern by like reading those people's tweets. I kind of saw a pattern there. It was really like a spiral, and then like they realized and they shut down, they like deleted Twitter from their phones, or any messaging and other stuff. And I think I'm at the point where I also need to do that when it comes to like vacation, PDO, whatever. Because I'm just like, as you said, Duffy, my free time is on the table when it comes to Twitter and catching up and keeping up, because work-life balance in mind is like, not work, but what is not work for, like, Kubernetes is so exciting and all the space, like what does not work there? I need to really get better there, because I think I might end in the same kind of spiral of just soaking in more until I just burn out.
Yeah, and like Josh said, it's not that there isn't a value. Obviously, we derive a huge value from it. That's why we own it.
Yeah.
But you have to weigh things, and what are your goals, and how is that the best way to goals from where you are right now? And maybe, Twitter you use for a while, ramp up your knowledge, ramp up, the connections, because it's great for making connections. And then you step back and focus on something else, and go on the cycle. This is how I'm thinking now. And just like Olive was saying, books are great, blog posts are great, and I absolutely agree with that. It's just that I don't have even the time. And when if I had the time, I've been reading code and I've been reading things all day long. It's just really tiring for me at the end of the day to sit down and read more. I actually want to invest in learning how to speed read to solve that problem, because I do a lot of books and blog posts. So something on my list.
One of the biggest tips in speed reading I ever learned was that you frequently, when you read, you think of saying the word. And if you can get out of that habit, of saying the word, even with your mouth, or you just get out of that habit, that will already increase the quickness with which you read.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, that's a trippy one.
Because I think being bilingual, I totally like it. That really helps me understand things, like saying the words.
Yeah. The other one that,
Anyway.
So to this point, to your point, I think the point that we're all kind of like working around here is there's a great panel that came out at KubeCon EU in 2019 that was put on by Aaron Krickenberger, Ritu Lina, Ashley McNamara, Stephen Augustus, Noah. These folks are all very high output people. I mean, they do a lot of stuff. Especially with regard to community or just getting, and so they put on a panel that was talking about burnout and self-care, and I think that it's definitely worth checking that one out, and actually also thinking about like what keeping up means to you, and making sure that you're measuring that against your ability to sustain is incredibly important, right? Like I feel like keeping up is one of those subjects where we end up, it's almost insidious in its way to, it's a thing that we can just do all the time. We can just spend all of our time, any free moment that you have, you're sitting on the bus, you're trying to keep up with things. And because that happens so much, I feel like that is sort of one of the ways that we can feel burnt out at the end of the day. We can feel like we did a lot of things, but there was no real result to it, keep in mind that's part of it, right? Like when you're thinking about how we keep up with it, make sure that the value to your time is still something that you have some cognizance about, that you have some thought about, like, is it worth it to me to spend these 6 hours reading everything, right? Or would it be better for me to spend some of that time just not reading, like doing something else, like make a cake, for crying out loud, like.
And something that's a lot of times we don't allow ourselves to do, and I decided to speak for everybody, I'm sorry, I just do nothing, because our brain needs that. We need to just not be listening, not be reading, just nothing, just sit and look at the ceiling. Our brain needs that. Ideally, look at nature, like look outside, look at tree, or go for a walk. We need that, because that recharges the brain. Anyway, one thing that I wanted to to bring up. Maybe we can mention some real quick because we're coming up at the top of the hour. How do how do they help users of those projects to be up to date with what they are doing?
So yeah, I mean, I think those are the different patterns that we're talking about. So I think the blog posts help. I like the idea of having blogs that are targeted toward different audiences. I like the idea of having an aggregator for a particular project. I mean, obviously, Kubernetes is such a huge ecosystem that if you have things like Kube Weekly, and I know that there are actually quite a number of things out there that try and do this, but if we can kind of agree on one, like Kube Weekly, I think is a pretty good one because it's actually run by the CNCF, so it kind of falls within that sort of governance model. But having an aggregator where you can actually like produce content or curate content as it relates to your project is helpful. And then, office hours, I think, is also helpful to Josh's point. I mean, like the office hours and SIG hours are very similar things. I mean, like office hours are like, how do the developers think about what's happening with the space? This is an opportunity for you as an end user to show up and ask questions. Those sorts of patterns, I think, all are incredibly helpful as a project to get out there and do those things.
Yeah, and those summary articles or the sort of TLDRs that Michael mentioned earlier, I think I need more of them kind of things in my life because I do a lot of reading because I think my brain is a bit weird in that I need to read something about like 5 or 6 different times from 5 or 6 different kind of articles for it to sort of frame in my head. So what I'm trying to like for 2020, and I've always tried to do this is like, if I think somebody knows all about this and, it would save me reading those 5, 6, 7 articles. And if that person has the time, I try and sort of reach out to them and say, listen, have you got 20 minutes or so to explain this topic to me? Can I ask you questions about it? It just saves my eyes reading a screen, and it just saves me time. I just need a kind of a TLDR summary of a project or a feature or something, just so I can kind of know what it's about in my head and talk fairly sort of confidently about it. If I need to get sort of further down under the weeds, then there's more reading to kind of do from maybe the coding or the technical side. But sometimes I can't figure out what this feature sort of means and what's its use case in the real world. And I have to kind of wade through lots of articles and sometimes kind of vendor specific ones and they've got a different slant than maybe an independent one and trying to marry those bits up in my head kind of is a bit, it's a bit hard for me. And there's a wealth of information. So if you're interested in a topic and there's like hundreds of articles and you start reading 4 or 5 and they're like all slightly different. But, obviously it comes to eventually you kind of figure out you're confident and I understand what that product's about, but it's taken a long time to get there and it's taken a lot of reading time. So TLDRs like really work. And I think it was Josh who mentioned before, like we have this thing internally where we do bench demos and that's kind of like a TLDR, and a show and tell really quickly, like this is what this does and this is why we need to know about it. And this is why our customers need to know about it. The end, and that's really, really useful because that's just saved a whole bunch of people a whole bunch of time figuring out A, whether they need to know about it and B, actually now understanding that product or feature at the end of the 5-10 minutes, which is what they typically are. So they're very useful for me. Short snippets of information. Maybe we're back to Twitter.
I think similar to the idea of giving a demo, all of you made me think of something, and that is that I think one of the ways that I kind of keep up with the space is actually through writing along with reading. And I think the notion of and this admittedly takes up time and the whole quality of life conversation comes in, but using writing to help develop your thoughts and kind of aggregate all these crazy inputs and try to be somewhat concise, which I know I struggle with, around something I've learned, it's helped me a ton. And then that asset kind of becomes reusable to share with other people, the thing that you wrote. So for people listening to this, I guess maybe a call to action for 2020, if that's kind of your style as well, consider starting to write yourself and becoming a resource, right? Because even if you're new to this space, you'd be amazed at how just writing from your perspective can help other people.
To that end, I think...
Sorry, that's a great point, yeah.
I think another one that I've actually been impressed with lately is that a number of consumer companies, like people out there, like Lyft and companies like that, have actually started to surface engineering blogs around how they're using technology and how they're using technology to solve things. Which I think, as a service provider, or as somebody who's involved in the community at Kubernetes, I find those to be incredibly valuable because I get to actually see how those things are done. I mean, at the same time, I see things like, we talk about KubeCon, which is a convention that happens every year. Obviously, the project is large enough to support it. But there's actually an incentive, if you are a consumer of that project, to go and talk about how you're using it, right? Like it's incentivized in that it is more likely your talk will be accepted if you are a consumer of the product than somebody building it, right? Like we hear from people building it all the time, and I love that idea of incentivizing people who are using this thing to get out there and talk about it, or share their ideas about it, or how they're using it. What problems did it solve for them? That is critical, I think.
And also, I make a suggestion is not so much following on the thread that we're talking about just now, but like on the general thread of this episode. If you have resources that you do use to keep up with things, stop this recording right now and go and give them a like, give them a follow, give them a thumbs up, show somehow appreciation. Because like what Zephy said just now, he was saying, oh, it's so helpful when I read a blog post. But people who are writing, they want to know that. So give them some indication. It counts a lot. It counts a lot. It takes a lot of effort to sit down and write something or produce a podcast. And if you take any derive any benefit from it, show appreciation. It motivates people to keep doing it.
Yeah, agreed.
I think that's a great point, maybe to close off this episode, because it reiterates that just consuming and keeping up, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't give back, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a way of giving back, which is really important to keep that flow and stream.
Yeah, I go through a lot of YouTube videos, and sometimes I just play one after the other. But sometimes, I've been making a point of going back and liking it. Liking the ones I like, obviously. I don't like everything. I mean, things that I don't like, I don't listening, but you know what I mean? It's just, it takes no efforts, but just so people know, okay, you did a good job here. By the way, go on iTunes and rate us so we will know that you liked it, and will help people find our show, our podcast. And if you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like, you know.
Appreciate it. All right. Well, I think unless anybody has any final thoughts, I think that's what we wanted to cover this session. So thank you all very, very much, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Look at the show.
Bye, look at the show notes, thepodlets.io.
Exactly.
Bye.